Okay, people are still joining, but we're going to have to start. It's 6:04. Good evening, everyone. My name is Adrienne Esposito. I'm the Executive Director of Citizens Campaign for the Environment. I'm joined with my co-host.
Hi, I'm Julie Ty. I'm president of the New York League of Conservation Voters Education Fund. Delighted to be here with you once again, Adrienne.
You too. So folks, in the year 2023, last year, we had some progress and we had some setbacks for offshore wind here in New York. But as we like to say, the road to success is not a straight line. Sometimes it has a couple of curves. But all in all, we are making progress. And what we want to do today is give you an update. There's so much that happened last year. And we also know it got a little bit confusing. Some projects decided to discontinue. Other projects now have been added on. I do want to say we are delighted to have with us this evening 3 new projects. They will each be presenting. We have Excelsior, Attentive, and also Community Wind with us. And these are 3 new projects that you may not know about. And they're going to give you a little presentation on their projects, where they're going to connect to, how much power, and what that means for New York State. But let's do a happy review. Jordan, can you bring the slides up? Oh, and also, folks, if you have questions, please put them in the chat, or the Q&A, I should say. Is it the Q&A, Julie?
Q&A.
Q&A. Put them in the Q&A. We're going to get to as many as possible. And if you have questions, particularly for these 3 new developers, that would be great too. Okay, next slide. So I don't need to tell most of you this, but I think you know that human activities through greenhouse gas emissions are causing climate change. I don't know if you know about the United Nations report that came out again last year, confirming this. Next. Keep going. Oh, actually, go back. I just want to, this is a statistic I think is very important. This is a NOAA statistic, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, said for last year, just for the first 8 months of the year, because sometimes we get questions, Julie and I, all the time. Well, how much is offshore wind going to cost? And I think the question is, how much is it going to cost to not transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy? Well, here's one number. NOAA said that for the first 8 months of last year, and this doesn't even include some of the storms that occurred during the end of the year, that there were 23 different, 23 different separate disasters that were declared, with the deaths of 25 people and a reported damage for each disaster of billion or more each, totaling 57.6 billion just for the first 8 months of last year. Now that's a price tag. Next. And then also, some people say, what will offshore wind do to my bill? And again, here's what's happened to our electric bill. This is a New York State chart without anything to do with wind. As you can see, it goes up. It goes up because fossil fuels go up. It is a finite resource. Fossil fuels are subject to geopolitical consequences. You may or may not know, but last year, Saudi Arabia and Russia reached a deal to limit the amount of oil they would be extracting because they particularly wanted to drive up the cost of oil for America. So with offshore wind, we're not going to have those issues. I've also heard some communities say, but offshore wind is still foreign owned from Denmark and other companies. And I'm thinking, well, I'd rather have an energy relationship with Denmark and with Norway than with Russia and Saudi Arabia. So I just wanted to give people that this chart shows 120% increase in electricity costs because of our addiction to fossil fuels. Next. And also, lastly, I'm going to say, some people say, I don't want to look at wind. And I just want to give you a gentle reminder that we look at where our power comes from now, whether it's the Northport Power Plant, the Barrett Power Plant, Port Jefferson, and a myriad of smaller, what's called peaker plants that we only use in the summertime. We can see them and they do damage. Julie?
So we here in New York State, and you've heard this from us many times, have passed aggressive state legislation called the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. It was passed in 2019. It is one of the most ambitious climate laws in the entire country. At the time, it was the most ambitious law in the country that really is pushing us towards 70% renewable energy by 2030 and getting to 100% carbon-free energy by 2040. So making sure that we're moving all of our electricity to renewable and zero emission resources. That includes trying to make the entire economy carbon neutral by the year 2050. So we have a lot of work in order to do that, and offshore wind plays an important role. Right now, the law calls for 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind to be generated in state by 2035. And we need to be making investments in frontline communities and disadvantaged communities so that they get the benefits associated with this transition, as well as strong protections for labor, so that we're making sure that we're getting good jobs that support, family wages. Next slide. We know that offshore wind is not new, right? It's new to the United States. We haven't been using it for very long, but it's not new at all. Like, we have a farm in Denmark that's been there since 1991. That's been generating 2,200 megawatts of power. And they were decommissioned in 2017 after it was used for 25 years. So really, this is something that's been around for quite a while, and it's being used around the world. Next slide. So in Europe right now, they're getting about 28,000 megawatts of power from offshore wind. Meanwhile, over in China, they're getting about 27,000 megawatts from offshore wind. And here in the United States, what are we doing? By the end of this year, we will have about 980 megawatts of power. That includes, actually, go to the next slide. There's 5 turbines that have been spinning. We have one project that's working now, but we're working on that. We're trying to make this transition. So the federal government leases offshore land underwater for offshore wind purposes. And right now, there are a number of projects that are in contract. We're going to hear about some of them today, but we wanted to show you where they are on a map so you have an idea. South Fork Wind, which is that orange one way to the right of Montauk, or east of Montauk, south of Rhode Island, is the first offshore wind project in New York. They already have a number of turbines spinning. It's about 35 miles east of Montauk. They have another project that's been proposed, Sunrise Wind, that's just south of there. Then way south of Long Beach, there's another project called Empire Wind 1, as well as Excelsior Wind. And then further south, Attentive Energy 1 and Community Offshore Wind. We're going to hear about Excelsior, Attentive, and Community Offshore Wind more today, but we wanted to show you where they all are. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we have our first offshore wind farm. That, in fact, is a picture of the first turbine that has been that is providing power for Long Island. We started, ground broke in February of 2022. It's been under construction. They're going to have 12 turbines when they're done, and they have a cable connection that's already hooked up. So as soon as that first wind turbine was ready, it started providing power to Long Island, which it began to do in December. It was very exciting for us to finally move from talking about offshore wind to actually getting power from offshore wind. Next slide. So I mentioned this earlier, but we have these 3 projects that have already been through a process. They're going through permitting. They're South Fork Wind, which is about 130 megawatts. It's going to provide enough power for about 70,000 homes. Then Empire Wind 1, that's that project that's south of Long Beach. That's about 800 plus megawatts. It's going to provide enough energy about 500,000 homes. They resubmitted a bid to New York State in January that will be decided on presumably this month. And then Sunrise Wind has about 880 megawatts that would again provide enough power for about 500,000 homes. They also resubmitted a bid to New York State that will be decided presumably this month. There were 2 other projects. Are they on the next slide? Maybe, or are we at the end? Oh, there we go. Oh, no. There were 2 other projects they withdrew. As we mentioned, the Empire Wind 2 and Beacon Wind, which was east, sort of south of Martha's Vineyard-ish area, south of Massachusetts. Those two projects have withdrawn, and so they're not currently under consideration. But we have these three projects. So Attentive Energy is pursuing one. It's about 1,400 megawatts. It's going to provide about 700,000 homes annually. Community Offshore Wind is about 1,300 megawatts. That's again going to be about 500,000 homes that they can provide. And Excelsior Wind, which is also 1,300 megawatts, also about 650,000 homes. But rather than hear about it from me and Adrian, we're going to hear from the companies themselves. And this is the first of what will ultimately be multiple discussions about these projects, since they're at the very beginning. And there was a lot to learn as we go along. So with that, I believe we're starting with Excelsior.
Yes, that's correct. And I think one of the things we just wanted to point out to everyone is that although wind energy is new to America, it's not new. You can see from the amount of energy that's generated in Europe and China and many other countries, we only use those as an example, is that the United States is actually catching up to the rest of the world. We're not leading the rest of the world. So a lot of the questions that folks have, and I see some in the chat already, we're going to get to them, but we do have answers for them. So we're going to go to Excelsior first.
Thank you, Julie and Adrian. All right.
There we go. Thanks, Andrea. That worked.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you everybody for having me today. Make sure. There we go.
Perfect.
Good. All right. My name is Andrea Bonilla. I am External Affairs Manager for Vineyard Offshore, and I'm excited to tell you a little bit about Excelsior Wind today. So Excelsior Wind is a project of Vineyard Offshore. Vineyard Offshore is a company funded out of CIP, Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners. CIP is a leader in renewable energy investments all around the world: Europe, Asia, South America, North America, Australia. And just here in the United States, we have a capacity of about 6 gigawatts for development, both on the East Coast and the West Coast. Vineyard Offshore is the parent company for a project called Vineyard Wind, which just also went online with first power recently in January of this year. It is currently producing about 28 megawatts of power for the state of Massachusetts. And at the end of this year, when it's completed, it will be producing 800 megawatts. So I'll tell you a little bit about Excelsior Wind. It comes from our lease area called 544. It's about 24 miles south of Fire Island and 31 miles south of Jones Beach. It was a provisional award in conjunction with the other two projects that we'll be talking about today. So what does that mean? That means that out of New York State's third RFP that came out in 2022 and was due at the beginning of 2023, these three awards were given by the state at the end of October of 2023, and all three of us are in the process of contracting with the state at the moment. Hopefully that'll be done in about a month or two, and then we will move on to the rest of the timelines of our projects. So Excelsior Wind is a 1,300 megawatt project. It will interconnect into a substation in Uniondale called East Garden City. And at the moment, we are evaluating all our landfall options, focusing on a big grassroots community engagement effort so that we can make sure that we locate our transmission route as best as possible, keeping in mind all sorts of community input. Based on our calculations, our 1,300 megawatt offshore wind farm will be approximately enough for 700,000 homes, which is a lot if you think about it. It'll be enough to reduce 1.1 million metric tons of carbon dioxide and the equivalent of taking 225,000 cars off the road. So if we look at some of the statistics that Adrian shared with us and how we are impacted as a region and as a country, and really as a globe by climate change, offshore wind has the ability to really transform some of that and mitigate some of those effects that we've been looking at. Oh, sorry, I don't know what happened Okay, so our approach to stakeholder engagement, I think, comes from our success in Vineyard Wind. We worked really closely with all our community, our landfall, transmission, point of interconnection, and also for where our operations and maintenance facility is going to be located. We believe really strongly in the importance of connecting with community members, tribes, workforce development partners, education partners, governments, and anyone really who is impacted in any good, positive, or potentially, inconvenience ways during the project. And we are looking forward to doing the same in New York. We have had an extensive outreach process for the last year or so, and we're looking forward to doing that even more as we move forward. We are actively hiring, and we have added a few team members to our local New York team. So we're excited for them to also work closely with us. This is part of our current external affairs team. So Christian Scorzoni, myself, Marlena, whom some of you have already met. She's our workforce development manager. Erin Siegel, who recently joined our team as our community liaison, and Nora, who is our development director, and she is in charge of all our technical and planning processes. I've added our email address here for anybody who would like to contact us. Please do so. I'm happy to provide any more answers or specific questions. I think that a couple of the important highlights that are not here are that this project is due to be completed around 2030, 2031. So, we will be done negotiating with the state within the next month or two. Then we have a permitting timeline of about 3 to 4 years, both on the federal side and the state side. And those run concurrently to each other. And that is a big part of our community engagement process. Is a lot of input goes into both of those permitting processes. So we look forward to having people involved in those. And then after that, it's about a 3-year construction process, depending on time of year restrictions, seasonal restrictions, and all the conditions that are agreed with local communities, municipalities, tribes, based on any mitigation and minimization efforts that we have to do. So I think that's all for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrea. We look forward to having you back in the Q&A. Next, we're going to have Karen from Attentive.
Great. Thanks so much, Adrian and Julie, for inviting us. I'm going to share my screen here. Bear with me for a moment. All right. Can you all see the slides here?
Yes.
Great. Thank you. So just to follow up Andrea's presentation, we are another offshore wind project called Attentive Energy 1 that was also awarded in late last year in New York State's third offshore wind solicitation, and received a provisional award from the state to bring energy into the New York grid. I'll tell you a little bit about our joint venture and the sponsors behind this project. Attentive Energy 1 combines the global resources and offshore expertise of TotalEnergies and Corio generation, as well as Rise Light and Power's proven track record of powering New York City with deep community relationships. So TotalEnergies is a multi-energy global company with a significant renewables footprint in the United States, including a portfolio of 4 gigawatts of U.S. offshore wind in development, and overall 25 gigawatts of renewables. That includes a large solar portfolio in the United States as well. And globally has a strong track record of 100 gigawatts of renewables. And that includes operational offshore wind farms, such as the recently operational Seagreen project off the coast of Scotland, which is powering 1 million plus homes with renewable energy. We've partnered with these 2 entities, Corio Generation, also an offshore wind developer with a global portfolio that has done work with TotalEnergies in the past, and with Rise Light and Power, which is a Queens, New York-based energy asset manager operating the city's largest power plant, the Ravenswood Generating Station in Long Island City, Rise Light and Power has a plan called Renewable Ravenswood, which seeks to, over time, deploy different clean energy initiatives to retire the fossil fuel infrastructure at the plant. And Attentive Energy 1 is the gateway, the first project that is part of that Renewable Ravenswood plan. The following is a snapshot of some of the key technical components of the project. As you can see, the lease area here, 538 in the harbor. This was acquired during a lease auction in 2022. And since that time, the plan was submitted. The Attentive Energy 1 plan was submitted to NYSERDA. A few key points here. The lease area is about 50 miles south of Jones Beach, well outside of the viewshed. The point of interconnection, as I mentioned, is the Ravenswood generating station. And the lease area can bring 1,400 megawatts into the New York market. The other half is actually about 1,300 megawatts into New Jersey. So the lease area is split into two projects, and we were recently awarded an Attentive Energy 2 project to bring power into New Jersey. As mentioned earlier, the 1.4 megawatts, or rather 1.4 gigawatts, can power up to 700,000 homes in New York. And the project timeline, which I'll get into a little bit more further into the presentation, is currently in the process of permitting, finalizing the contract with NYSERDA, and is aiming to be operational by 2030. So a little bit about the history of our on-the-ground engagement. Even going back 5 years now, several years before acquiring the lease area, our team has been on the ground doing the legwork, having the conversations, having the engagement to really understand what are different communities and institutions' interests in renewable energy and how to deploy these projects in a responsible, transparent, and thoughtful way. And the following is really a snapshot of some of our project partners and stakeholders that we've been speaking to early, frequent, and often as part of our Attentive Energy 1 project. This includes NYCHA housing around the Ravenswood generating station. The Queensbridge houses located adjacent to the power plant is one of the nation's largest housing projects, and the tenants there have been deeply involved in these conversations, learning about construction, development, supply chain, employment opportunities, and really weighing in on the promise of clean energy in the community. We've also been deeply engaged with different academic institutions like City University of New York, LaGuardia Community College will be home to an offshore wind training center as part of the Attentive Energy 1 project. And other institutions like SUNY Maritime, which is really kind of bringing a whole new phase of the working waterfront back to New York and training mariners to be part of the offshore wind sector. Similarly, talking with small and medium-sized businesses around the state, not just in New York City, to get them plugged into the offshore wind supply chain. And importantly, with labor, the union workforce, which is going to be key in standing up these offshore wind projects and transitioning to clean energy. And the picture there in the bottom left is U.S. Secretary of Energy Granholm visiting the Ravenswood generating station last year. So what is the plan all about? And here are some of the key commitments that will be deployed as part of Attentive Energy 1. The project will begin to retire some of the fossil fuel generation, about 400 megawatts of fossil fuel generation at the power plant. This is a significant environmental justice action aligned with the governor's goals for the Climate Leadership and Protection Act, and reduces carbon emissions by more than 1 million tons. As mentioned, importantly, the 100+ utility workers at the plant will be part of a just transition for union workers to transition to clean energy. And we're also engaged with a number of different locals in training efforts as part of this project. Overall, this will generate 2,600 new jobs in the state and $20+ billion in economic activity. The plant itself will become home to an operations and maintenance hub. I'll get into that a little bit in a following slide. And importantly, there's a significant community investment, $300 million plus of partnerships with different entities like universities, like grassroots organizations, environmental conservation initiatives and research initiatives that will help to stand up this project and to really build an inclusive offshore wind sector. This is an aerial view of the Ravenswood generating station that shows just a little bit of a snapshot of what will take place during the construction and development. So you see the power plant here, and at one of the edges of the plant, there will be a new converter station and offshore wind operations center. This is both for technical purposes of bringing the cable that would go up the East River right into the plant. There is no cabling on land beyond the waterfront infrastructure. So the cable comes in and plugs directly into this new converter station at the plant. And alongside here would be a new port that can accommodate service operation vessels and crew transfer vessels to go out into the actual lease area to do different operational and maintenance projects. There is already a small working port here that does accommodate some vessels, and it would be retrofitted for the purposes of the project.
Can you just remind the
Sure.
participants where Ravenswood is again? Because there's a lot of questions in the chat about where does the power go?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So the Ravenswood generating station is located in Long Island City, Queens. That's Western Queens, right alongside the East River. If you look at a map and locate the Queensboro Bridge, it's right adjacent to the bridge. And these kind of red and white iconic smokestacks are pretty visible from the New York City skyline. So yeah, Western Queens, Long Island City, and the power would go into the New York City grid for this project. A little bit about what we're up to currently, and this has to do with our permitting work. Like all of these projects that you're hearing about today have state and federal and local permitting requirements. And I think project maturity is a really important part of getting these off the ground. Our permitting teams have been busy at work on moving these various permits forward. And just to give you two quick snapshots of what that looks like. So we've been doing marine surveys out in the harbor and on the East River, geophysical surveys to look at constructability for the cable and to do different seafloor assessments. And you see the picture of the survey vessel here on the left. And on the right is a buoy that was actually deployed just a few weeks ago out of Miller's Launch in Staten Island to do different assessments in our lease area. And this is required by the Federal Bureau of Ocean Energy Management permitting process to collect different data from the lease area. And so these two pictures signal some of the kinds of work that are currently underway for our project, because we're very early. This is well pre any kind of construction. We're in the midst of survey work and the permitting that will be required by the state. And in the state, that is what's called the Article 7 process. The Public Service Commission permits transmission infrastructure, and that will be bringing that cable into the converter station at Ravenswood. And on the federal side is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management that permits the construction and operations plans. And for us, the timeline, without getting super in the weeds, looks a little bit like this. Between 24 and 26 is the permitting and development process. Between 26 and 29 is the construction process, and then seeking to get to operations by 29, 2030 for the project. And I will end here, and happy to take questions, and also encourage folks to visit the website attentiveenergy.com, sign up for our newsletter for project updates and events, and also our social media for different project updates. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I just want to say there's lots of questions in the chat about will the slides be available? If you're a participant in this WebEx, yes, we will get them out to you. Give us to the end of the week. We just need a couple of days, but you will get an email with the PowerPoints. And last but not least, we're going to hear from Jacqueline Roth, representing Community Energy. Jacqueline, you're up.
Thank you so much. Jordan, thank you so much for sharing our slides. All right, so my name is Jacqueline Ruth. I am the Government Affairs Manager for the Community Offshore Wind Project. Thanks everybody for being here and sticking around. Thanks Adrian and Julie for organizing tonight's event. Next slide, please. All right, so Community Offshore Wind is a joint venture of RWE and National Grid Ventures. And together we bring the combined expertise of two major energy companies with the experience to deliver a project of this magnitude. So most folks know who National Grid is, but National Grid Ventures operates outside of the core business. We develop these large-scale commercial renewable energy projects. And RWE is one of the world's leading companies in offshore wind, active across the entire value chain from project conception to development, construction, operation, and maintenance. So in February of 2022, our joint venture acquired the largest lease area in the New York Bight. And in October of this year, we were awarded a provisional contract to develop 1.3 gigawatts of new offshore wind capacity. So that's, as Adrian said, enough to power about 500,000 homes in New York. Next slide, please. So our total lease area has the capacity to produce 3.2 gigawatts of new offshore wind capacity. Our first project, our provisionally awarded project in Brooklyn, will produce 1.3. And some of the economic impacts and community benefits can be seen here, including a 5% reduction in emissions for New York's power sector, which is something we're really proud of. And that equates to about 11 million cars off the road. So sometimes putting it that way is easier to understand. So our project will be interconnecting to Con Edison's new Brooklyn Clean Energy Hub, which is in the Vinegar Hill Dumbo area of Brooklyn, which supports New York City's ongoing electrification efforts. Some of the things listed here are sort of speak for themselves, some of our job numbers. One of our investments, we're investing $10 million in a childcare voucher program to really help folks break into the industry without some of the traditional barriers. Next slide, please. So in response to New York's expedited fourth offshore wind solicitation, we just submitted a proposal for a second New York project. So this project would generate an additional 1.3 gigawatts of clean energy and deliver more than 1 billion in direct economic benefits over the project's lifetime. This second proposed project would build on the investments that we've already outlined in our first proposal. Additional funding includes almost 50 million in additional workforce development and community program funding, 15 million for supportive services for workers, including transportation and that childcare program I just referenced, to ensure that everybody is able to have allocated 20 million. Oh, what happened there? 20 million for the Powering Up Fund to address gaps in workforce training and preparation, and also 4 million for education and youth employment programming to prepare today's youth to get into this new sector. This proposal also includes an additional 38 million into environmental monitoring and fishery mitigations, bringing our total commitment to 76 million. Next slide, please. So Community Offshore Wind is committed to building an inclusive project that prioritizes engagement and feedback with the community that it serves along the lifetime of the project. So we are consulting with all of our stakeholders to ensure minimal disruption and maximum community input. We are very committed to these 4 pillars of stakeholder engagement to ensure we're doing the right thing all the way from start to finish. All right, next slide, please. Some of the things we've done so far, we have been heavily engaged in our communities across the state of New York, even before we were awarded our project. So we've done things like large-scale donations of food and winter clothing to support families in need, helping with waterfront preservation and cleanup efforts. We've partnered with a number of community organizations and schools to expand access to STEM education. We funded some field trips to just make sure that kids are being exposed to these concepts and really thinking about it at an early age. And our $130 million package of economic development investments will help New York communities prepare their workforce for the clean energy jobs of tomorrow and break down longstanding barriers that are far too often prevent folks from pursuing these stable, good-paying jobs. Okay, next slide, please. So we want to hear from you. I know there's quite a bit of folks here today, so please reach out with any questions or concerns. I know some of my colleagues talked about Development timelines, ours is about 10 years as well. So we aim to be operational by 2030, 2031. So right now we are in the initial planning phase, and construction should begin between 2027 and 2030. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. We have a ton of questions. We also have a ton of people on this Zoom tonight. And so thank you, everyone, again for joining. We're going to just do rapid fire questions and answers. Julie and I will moderate back and forth. Julie, why don't you take the first question about why it's important to get energy into New York City?
Sure. So, because a number of people have asked, so the projects are actually split. Some of the projects that we have are going to go into Long Island. Some of them are going to go into New York City. Is about 90% of the energy in Long Island and New York City comes from fossil fuels. So there is a need for moving off of fossil fuels for public health reasons. A lot of these power plants that you're talking about, the one that Karen, for example, talked about, the Ravenswood plant, is located in a disadvantaged community where they've been, getting fossil fuel power right now, and the public health impacts associated with that. So we need to make sure that we're getting cleaner air all across our state, whereas the upstate grid is 90% clean. So the Attentive project and the Community Offshore Wind project are both going to bring power directly into New York City, which means that transmission will go directly into New York City as well, as opposed to having to bring power from outside of New York City in. Whereas the Vineyard project and South Fork Wind, and then potentially Sunrise will all bring power right into Long Island, and Empire One would also come into New York City. So there is a mix of Long Island and New York City where these projects will be bringing power.
Thank you. Okay, the next one, I know, Andrea, you answered in the Q&A. Thank you, but I think we should answer it out loud too. Taylor has asked about the lifespan of decommissioning these offshore wind farms, and we get this question a lot too. The lifespan is 20 years, 25 years. Sometimes I hear 30 years. We know from the European experience. And then what happens once we reach the limit? So Andrea, would you like to take that one?
Sure, Adrian. So every project has a certain lifetime based on the technology and the equipment that it was built on. And so as well as the power purchase agreement or REC that it was given offtake with. At the end of that lifetime, occasionally some of the wind farms have additional lifetime that they can keep producing power to where they are producing power to. And then eventually, kind of like an old cell phone or a laptop or, all the technology we use, there are bigger, better, nicer, more efficient things. And so part of that in our proposals, we also have to include these very thorough decommissioning plans on what we're going to do with all that equipment once the offshore wind farms are done producing. So,
and you have to put up a bond too, right?
Sorry?
You have to put up a bond.
Yes, that's correct. So we have to make sure that there's a way for them to come down no matter what.
Thank you.
And then there was a related question about, putting new turbines up in places where old turbines had been. And that is not a United States problem because we only have 5 turbines spinning right now, and they're all relatively new. So that is something that will be determined, 20, 30 years from now. But certainly we would encourage, as environmental organizations, of course, using areas that had previously been disturbed, and using existing infrastructure to the maximum extent possible.
And I really, Karen, also, I don't know if you want to chime in, but you have a very complete answer too about the end of service processing methods that are maturing.
Yeah, thank you for that. This is definitely an evolving technology in space for what's going to happen 20 to 25 years out from now. This is an area where we're learning Europe's lessons and seeing how different recycling initiatives are coming into play, or even repurposing initiatives. We've seen some blades that are being retired being used as street furniture, or being used as even art. And so clearly we need multi-purpose plans, right? We need the recycling plans, but there are also lessons being learned out of how to actually reuse the industrial infrastructure. And we do have the benefit of time a little bit to have some of this technology developed. And, you know, a lot of the offshore wind developers are also funding a lot of R&D initiatives in these spaces to help alongside the project so that when it is time to retire the infrastructure, we do have alternatives and options in place.
Thank you. This is another question we get a lot. How extensive are the biological surveys? And Andrew, I know you answered this one, but I think we should say it out loud for the rest of the folks here. How extensive are the biological surveys in areas where wind farms might be sited? And talking about marine organisms in that area, endangered species. And I don't know why this person is asking about the Hudson Canyon, but perhaps you can address that, whoever wants to.
Sure. So the biological and marine life surveys are rather extensive. They use existing surveys that the federal government, BOEM, NOAA, and other federal agencies have ongoing and historically, plus another few years of surveying that we have to do as developers. And now the BOEM has also done what's called a PEIS, a programmatic environmental impact study that addresses not just the impacts per lease, but in conjunction of all the New York Bight leases that were done as of February 2022. Those surveys, like I said, go at least 3 to 5 years on the developer side from the time our lease starts, and that's why our federal permitting process takes about 5 years. And then there are additional surveys that we have to do on the state side, and those take about 2 to 3 years with a permitting process of 3 to 4 years. So once you reach the final approval processes, we have about hundreds, if not thousands, of conditions that are placed on every project in order to protect environmental conditions and marine life. And that goes from the time of construction starting all the way through the end of operations and maintenance and decommissioning of a wind farm.
Great. Thanks, Andrea.
Can I just
Yeah.
jump in for one quick second there, and
Yep.
would point folks to visit the NYSERDA website for permitting and approvals, because they give you the whole list of different permits, federal and state permits needed, and especially on the environmental and marine conservation side, it's a useful exercise to see what consultations pertaining to different laws are required. So for example, NOAA Fisheries says that you have to submit your plans in concert with the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act and the Fishery Conservation and Management Act. And then on the state side, there's similar coordination on permits for coastal environmental impact. So there are many regulations, state and federal, that are already on the books that our projects have to comply with. And again, I think this is a very handy sort of list. If you go on the NYSERDA permitting and approvals website, that'll give you step by step all of the permitting, especially as it relates to environmental and marine impacts.
Thanks, Karen. So Russ is asking, do offshore wind projects go through ORES approval? I can just take that, but and I know you've touched on this, all of you, I think, in your remarks, but ORES manages only onshore projects where all the construction is permitted by the state of New York, whereas the offshore wind project, the primary construction organization is BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and then the Department of Public Service for Article 7, this is so technical, but for the permitting of the transmission that's in state waters that brings it onto shore. So there's sort of a lot of pieces that go into that. And Karen obviously just pointed to a very in-depth resource on all the different facets that go into it. But the bottom line is no, offshore wind does not go through ORES. ORES is only for onshore wind and solar projects at this point in time.
Okay, question by Andrew. The ratio of megawatts to homes seems to be different in different proposals. And I know that, again, Andrea, you answered that, thank you. And I just want to add to it. And part of that is because the homes, in Brooklyn, as someone who grew up in Brooklyn for the first 11 years, maybe you can tell by my accent, which has never left, a brick row house in Brooklyn is going to be using less energy than those mega mansions out east. So sometimes the energy use and disbursement has to be calculated based on the energy use of that particular community. So you will see some slight variations from project to project, Andrew. So good question. Let's see what else we got here. All right, people are saying, and I think you guys did a good job of answering this, but Jacqueline, why don't you jump in on this too? How will you go about doing community outreach? So how does a wind company say, okay, this is my project, and how do you engage the community? What do you do?
It's a great question. We just finished a series of open houses across the state, hosted by NYSERDA, but all of the awarded projects were there. So really one-on-one conversations. We're also utilizing various email campaigns. At some point during the process, we will do traditional snail mail, flyering. We will also host a series of our own open houses in the communities that we are developing these projects in. So, I mean, traditional methods of outreach, but also learning what these specific communities need. You know, everybody responds to outreach differently and has different access to the internet or, you know, other things. But we do take, we take it very seriously. We get questions, we get back to people one-on-one. So, and I know all of our projects share that.
Here's one that's specific to you. Someone was asking, who owns Community Offshore Wind?
Sure. So Community Offshore Wind is a joint venture between RWE and National Grid Ventures. So I work for National Grid Ventures. We
Well, tell them what RWE is. I'm sure they don't know.
Sure. RWE is the second largest offshore wind producer in the world. And they've just begun breaking into the market here, but they have been around for quite some time and have a very robust portfolio of successful offshore wind projects. And the National Grid Ventures operates outside of the core business of National Grid. And we develop these commercial large-scale projects. We're not funded by ratepayers the way National Grid is. We're funded by investors. So a little bit different.
All right, so Nancy's asking if the product of the projects will go to New York City, Long Island, and New Jersey. The projects that we've discussed here today will go to Long Island and New York City. There are other projects that will go to New Jersey that are in the New York Bight, but are not projects that we've discussed here today. And there are other projects in other parts of the East Coast where they're also working on offshore wind. But all of the projects we talked about today are all going to New York City or Long Island. Bridget Fleming wants to know if we have learned some lessons from South Fork and how you're applying some of those lessons since we've been through a project that's actually gone to construction. I think we've all had the opportunity to learn a little bit from that, including me and Adrian. But I'd love to see if any of the companies would like to take that question.
I could take it. I actually worked on South Fork Wind for a little bit before I worked on Vineyard, so I think that's works. I think the lessons that are learned is really how much collective work it all takes, whether it's 12 turbines or 60 or 100 or these 3 projects that are going to be. It is a lot of really hard work. With every level of stakeholder that you can think of: federal government, state government, tribes, local municipalities, villages, cities, fire departments, school districts, water districts, sewer districts. You know, we have a slew of government layers here on Long Island, plus our workforce partners, education partners, labor partners, and all sorts of community-based organizations. And so I think the ultimate lesson is just how much work it takes and how important it is for us to get support from everybody and also just input at all times, right? If you have concerns, if you have questions, if you are unsure about something, if you think that something is not the way it is, or you want to see something done differently, I think I can speak for everyone here that says that we want to hear from you. We want to make sure that we're listening to you and that we're working together so that we can streamline the process and do it as efficiently as possible.
Thank you. I think it's worth just reading we have a charter boat captain who's on, Captain Paul. He is hoping that the developers negotiate leaving the turbine bases in and the reef habitat on the sea floor and adopt the rigs to reefs process already in use in the Gulf of Mexico. So that's something for you guys to consider. For the other participants, what happens is there is a reef effect. It's already happening out actually for the Rhode Island wind farm, where charter boats are going out there because they know now that's where fish are gathering because of the reef effect. Even though that's a very small wind farm, it's still allowing for new fish habitat to have been established. So I know charter boat captains love that. And obviously finding fish is important for their business. All right. Here's a question by Lisa. Will the new projects use the training center that's being developed at Brentwood? Or will training take place at LaGuardia? Karen?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the question. The answer is both and more. And I think that applies to many of the projects and also relevant to, I think, statewide impact, right? Because while we have our kind of points of interconnection and geography where a lot of the construction will take place, our focus has been on how to create statewide impact. And that includes partnering with academic institutions across the state. And so we do have an agreement with the National Offshore Wind Training Center in Brentwood. We also have plans to work with different schools in the CUNY system and the SUNY system, as well as research initiatives with, especially on environmental and marine monitoring with different academic institutions around the state. So the idea is really to create pathways of opportunity, whether you live in upstate New York or downstate or Long Island, to find ways to train up in technician opportunities, blue tech, ocean tech opportunities, or other manufacturing skills that can get you into the pipeline. And we're seeing really a great deal of interest from students, not just at the university level, but also even in middle school and high school, really trying to understand. And really, they're the best timed in a way, because as these projects really get underway, it's the young people that are entering university in a couple of years or entering different kinds of training programs that are going to have opportunities in this sector.
And I want to add to that. I mean, one thing that the League of Conservation Voters and Citizens Campaign for the Environment have been doing over the last several years is to say we not only want to transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy, but we want this renewable energy to lift all boats, to hire local workers, to offer it as an alternative to high school students who say, I may not go the college path, but I want to go into a trade that I'm going to be able to succeed at, I'm going to be able to get a good paying job at, and it's going to be something that's going to be sustainable for myself and for our family, and I can buy a house if I go into that job. So you'll all remember we used to have Grumman on Long Island, and that left a long, long time ago. And this would be a new way for to bring community benefits, economic benefits, as well as environmental and technological advances. So we wanted to do it in a comprehensive, holistic way that makes benefits, that produces benefits for everyone. And now maybe we'll let Taylor get the last question in here, and then I think we have to close. But Taylor's saying, and I know, Karen, you already answered this, but again, for the audience, because hardly anybody left, if those projects were completed, all these projects, and ready to go, what percentage of the mix of the portfolio would make up wind? Karen?
Yeah, so right now, there is a percentage that is wind in the state's portfolio, but the state's climate goals are seeking to get to renewables by 2030 targets, 2040 targets. So this will change over time. It's when we sort of say X number of homes will be powered by offshore wind, it's not sort of a snap of a finger and it all becomes wind the minute we turn the turbines on. But as the state builds out its renewable energy portfolio, and this includes everything from onshore wind to offshore wind to solar to hydro power being brought down with transmission, from Canada. This all builds out a portfolio of renewable energy that will get to the state's 100% clean energy targets over time. And so wind may be a smaller piece now, but it's certainly anticipated to grow in the coming years.
And actually on that front, one of the league's priorities for the year, and I know we're working on this with others in the sector, is to actually increase that goal over time to 20 gigawatts by 2050, because we know ultimately we're going to need more energy from offshore wind. This is one thing that New York has lots of. This is one that California can't beat us on. And there's a lot of need. And this is a way that we can get energy closer to the load, right? We know we use a lot more energy downstate than we do upstate. And so this is a way to get it closer to where that demand is. So we ultimately will need more, but it all needs to be done responsibly and carefully and with proper oversight, and making sure that we're taking care of the end of life management of the wind turbines and the habitat and the marine life, and addressing conflicts with users. And to Adrian's point, making sure that we have good jobs associated with it. So this is really the beginning of offshore wind in New York, and it's very exciting to be here.
And I just want to say, look, this is hard. We're transitioning the way we use electricity. We're transitioning from fossil fuels, which we have used since the Industrial Revolution, to something new. It's not easy, but it's going to be not just offshore wind, but we're building out large-scale solar, also individual rooftop solar, which is the technology has advanced, the prices come down. Julie and I have supported, and now it's being built, a transmission cable, as Karen mentioned, from Quebec, Canada, coming down to New York City for 1,200 megawatts of excess hydropower that Quebec has to go into the New York City market. This is a whole puzzle piece of answers that'll help us in this transition. Easy? It is not. Complicated? It is. But we want to thank everyone for participating tonight. I know there's a couple more questions in the chat. I'm sorry, we're not going to get to those. But for the many, many people who joined us this evening, thank you to Jacqueline, Andrea, and Karen. You guys were terrific, and we look forward to doing more of these educational Zoom events. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.